My torch shook when the shell tore the canvas, but my hand still had to find the right tag colour in the dust. The orders said the categories were clear, the morphine counted, the ambulances reserved only for those the system believed might live. I listened to the guns through the floorboards while I shifted men between piles, hiding a few ampules for the road and signing my name under damp ink. Every stretcher I marked against doctrine stayed with me longer than the barrage, carried in a ledger that no report ever mentioned. In the winter of 1944, a line of canvas tents stood on churned earth, a short drive behind a contested front in Europe. The ground had been flattened just enough for trucks to turn and field ambulances to reverse. Beyond a low rise, artillery flashed in steady patterns that rolled across the sky like distant weather. If this was the forward field hospital, positioned between maps that promised safety and roads that said otherwise, its task was simple on paper: receive the wounded from the aid posts, sort them, treat what could be treated, and pass the rest to larger hospitals in the rear. Inside one of the larger tents, a surgical nurse moved between a folding table, a crate of triage tags, and a ledger that never left her reach. Her uniform was plain and stained, sleeves rolled high, collar damp from hours of work in air that smelled of carbolic and wet canvas. She carried a small torch with its lens partly covered, the beam narrowed by tape to avoid throwing light against the blackout flaps. When the generator ran, bare bulbs gave a weak yellow haze. When it failed, the torch and a few lanterns kept the work from stopping altogether. The tent was marked outside with a simple sign in block letters. Inside, its real markers were paper and timing. On the table, stacks of triage tags were laid out by colour, edges softened from handling. Each tag had spaces for name, unit and time of first attention. Another line waited for the time and amount of morphine given. That line, more than any, demanded care. The nurse checked her watch. It was late in the night, though the guns had never allowed a clear sense of hours. The offensive had opened the previous evening with a barrage that shook dust from the tent poles. Infantry had gone forward under that curtain of fire. By midnight the first stretchers had arrived, covered in snow that melted into the blankets. Now they came in waves, the mud on the bearers' boots getting heavier with each trip. A driver pushed open the flap, letting in cold air and the smell of exhaust. 2 orderlies followed with a stretcher, moving carefully to avoid knocking into the men already laid out on the ground boards. The wounded man's tunic had been cut away at the aid post. Bandages were tied where there had been time and materials. His existing tag was soaked, the pencil marks blurred. The nurse went straight to the airway, then the chest, then the pulse at the neck. Her hands moved quickly, but each gesture was practiced rather than hurried. She called the essentials over her shoulder to a clerk at a small table. Age, approximate. Wounds, obvious. Responsive, not responsive. The clerk wrote in the thick strokes that would be hard to read after the ink bled in the damp. The nurse took a clean triage tag, copied what she could from the ruined one, and marked the category with a firm stroke. Those who could wait, those who must not, those whom doctrine placed beyond help. The system had been taught to her in training, with diagrams drawn on clean boards far from any front. Here it existed as card, cloth and breath. She pinned the tag to the remnants of the man's clothing and signalled the orderlies. They carried him to the section assigned to his colour, where other stretchers already lay edge to edge. Then she went back to the ledger. On a shelf built from ammunition crates, rows of morphine ampules lay in shallow wooden trays. Each row had been counted at the start of the shift. Each ampule drawn had to be recorded with number, time, and recipient. Under the weak light, the nurse ran her fingers down the last filled page, times marched in a narrow column, and each beside a dose and a tag number. Beside her lay an ink pad and a small stamp bearing the date and the hospital's code. Supply officers and auditors would look at these pages later. If the counts did not match the stock, there would be questions. The ledger, kept with such care, was both a duty and a defence. An orderly came up, hands red from cold water, asking for permission with just a look toward the morphine trays. The nurse did not reach for an ampule until she had opened the ledger. "Tag," she said. He gave the number, stumbling slightly over the figures. She wrote it beside the time, noted the dose, and only then nodded to the tray. The glass rattled faintly as he lifted one ampule and hurried back between the stretchers. On good days, the discipline held easily. On this night, yet the strain in the canvas walls echoed the strain in the system. The ground outside had become a paste of snow and earth. Stretcher bearers slid and cursed softly as they moved. Inside, men lay so close that boots and blankets overlapped. Orderlies edged sideways, one hand on the tent poles to steady themselves when the guns sent tremors through the floor. In the adjoining tent, surgeons worked over operating tables propped on trestles. Lamps were hung from crossbeams, swinging a little with each vibration. Steam rose from metal basins where instruments were boiled. The air smelled of burned tissue, ether, sweat, and the faint tang of fuel. Assistants handed clamps and sponges in a rhythm that, to the nurse, sounded like another kind of counting. A runner arrived with a folded message sheet, damp at the edges. The heading showed it had come from a medical headquarters farther to the rear. The text was short and composed in neutral language. Evacuation routes were under severe pressure. Ambulances were to be used only for those judged likely to survive transfer. Severe cases that could not be stabilized on site were to be treated locally as far as possible. The phrase covered much. The nurse folded the paper and slid it into a pocket inside the ledger cover. It would be needed when surgeons argued for immediate evacuation of a badly wounded man. It would also need to be set aside in certain moments, or no one would be sent back at all. Doctrine and reality met along the tent's central aisle. As the night wore on, the pattern of the wounded shifted. The first assault casualties had given way to those from counterattacks and gun positions. Then more burns appeared, more men with soot on their faces, more fragments en piernas scattered across exposed skin. Some walked in with improvised slings, others arrived motionless, carried by bearers who had nothing left to say. The early signs of limitation were already clear to the nurse. Sterile dressings were being cut into smaller pieces than the manuals prescribed. Blankets meant for individual use were spread over 2 stretchers where possible. Bedpans and enamel jugs had gone missing, broken or lost in the mud. She marked each shortage in a small notebook clipped to her belt, writing numbers instead of complaints. Shells had been falling in the distance all night, their flashes reflecting faintly on the underside of the clouds. The hill behind the hospital had so far kept the worst of it at a distance. Now the sound changed. One shell landed closer with a heavier crack and a shock that sent dust down from the tent ridge. Tin cups rattled. A lantern hook creaked. The next impact came nearer still, followed by a patter of earth and small stones against the canvas. Someone outside shouted, then lowered his voice, as if noise could adjust trajectories already set. Inside, orderlies hunched their shoulders but kept moving. The nurse tightened her grip on the ledger to stop it sliding from the table. She noted, almost absently, another time and dose even as the tent canvas shivered. By doctrine, marked and registered medical facilities were to be spared deliberate fire. By practice, batteries fired on coordinates and roads that careened under pressure. Maps were imprecise. Units moved, guns corrected by sound and flash. And a red cross on a tent could not stop fragments that did not know their target. Then the generator failed. Its hum stuttered, caught for a heartbeat, and went silent. The bulbs dimmed and went dark, leaving a thicker version of the night inside. There was a collective intake of breath and a soft rustle as men shifted on stretchers, suddenly more aware of the sounds outside. The nurse drew her torch from her pocket and clicked it on. The beam, narrowed by tape, cut a pale slice through the gloom. She held it low, angling it away from the entrance, keeping the circle of light on hands, tags, and the open ledger. Elsewhere, other small lights flared as orderlies and assistants found their torches and shielded lanterns. The hospital did not stop, but its world shrank to islands of light. Yet it was then that a shell landed close enough to tear through one of the outer tents. The blast slammed the air through the hospital lines. Canvas snapped. Metal basins fell. Fragments hissed past in the dark. A strip of the triage tent's roof shook loose, and a thin trickle of snow and dirt spilled down the wall. In that moment, the formal triage point near the entrance, drawn on so many instructional diagrams, became exposed ground. The nurse saw it with the same clarity as she saw a failing pulse. Doctrine had placed triage where incoming stretchers first arrived. The guns had just erased the assumptions behind that placement. She moved without ceremony. From now on, she said, triage would be done farther back near the central poles and the stacks of supply crates that rose like low walls. There was a shallow drainage channel there, dug days earlier to carry away meltwater. It now offered a slight depression in which to work. Orderlies were told to bring stretchers past the entrance and around the tent's interior curve before stopping. No signal of this adjustment went to headquarters, no form existed for it. It was an unofficial decision taken in the few seconds between one impact and the fear of the next. Men were shifted, lamps moved, the table with tags and ledger carried deeper into the tent. The nurse set her torch on its side so the beam washed across the new triage space instead of pointing upward like a flare. New wounded arrived, this time including those hurt in the hospital's own perimeter. A driver with a torn scalp where a fragment had grazed him near the unloading area, an orderly with a deep cut in the thigh from splintered wood, and a cook burned when a stove overturned under the blast. The categories on the tags did not distinguish between frontline and rear injuries. The nurse applied the same assessment, though the irony of triaging those meant to help did not escape her entirely. All the while, the morphine ledger continued to grow. Demand for relief increased as the wounds grew more severe. Doctrine insisted on maximum safe doses and clear intervals between them. It required that times be written immediately so later staff could adjust treatment. Under the torch beam, with the ground trembling and hands numb, that ideal sequence was hard to maintain. The nurse adapted in small, careful ways. Instead of recording each dose at the precise instant it was drawn, she began to group entries. In a brief lull between waves of stretchers, she would write several doses at once, noting approximate times based on her watch and the last clear mark. She underlined those clusters to remind herself that they were approximate. It was untidy but still anchored in reality. Without it, some doses would have gone unrecorded entirely. The physical stock, however, did not wait. Rows of ampules diminished. The nurse counted what remained and compared the figure with the running total in the ledger. The numbers matched, but she could see the end approaching. Supply to the rear was uncertain with roads under fire. She could not rely on timely resupply. Quietly, she divided the stock. Half remained in the main tray, where orderlies came under her eye and the clerks. A smaller portion she set aside in a separate box, wrapped in cloth, and tucked near the bottom of a crate. That reserve was for a movement, for the hours when wounded men would be jolted along cratered roads in the back of trucks, unable to be reached easily. The ledger showed only one pool. Only she and one trusted orderly knew how it had been split. Outside, artillery began to range on the road leading to the hospital. Drivers reported craters appearing where none had been before. The time between their departures and returns lengthened. One ambulance failed to come back at all. News of its loss passed in low voices at the tent entrance, measured less in shock than in the tightening of already strained calculations. Evacuation pressure, already high, sharpened. Rear hospitals signalled that they were near capacity. The order from the earlier message about restricting use of ambulances to those most likely to benefit now took on a harder edge. Yet here Doctrine's clean lines met the uneven ground of actual bodies and distance. At one point, 2 stretchers were set down almost together in the new triage area. On one, a man cried out steadily, clutching at the side rail. On the other, a man lay silent, eyes half open, his breathing shallow. A younger orderly hesitated, pulled by noise and instinct. The nurse placed his hand on the silent man's chest, made him feel the weak rise, opened an eyelid to show the dull response. Then she guided him to the other stretcher, showing the stronger pulse and clearer airway. The tags were marked accordingly. One went into the immediate column, one into delayed. The third category, the one few wished to use, waited in its stack. Its moment would come soon enough. Later in the night, a liaison officer arrived. Bringing verbal instructions from a headquarters that was already thinking of withdrawal. Artillery fire in the sector was expected to intensify and move deeper into the rear. The field hospital was to prepare for a possible rapid relocation, but no exact time was given. They were to remain in place, functioning fully, until told otherwise. The order placed the staff in a narrow corridor of responsibility. They had to keep receiving, sorting and treating the wounded under fire, while also readying those same wounded and their equipment for a move that might come at any moment. The nurse adjusted her mental map again. In addition to assigning categories, she began quietly marking which men could be moved quickly and which would require more time, space or hands. A small mark on the edge of a tag, meaningless to a stranger, gained importance for her and the orderlies who understood it. When the evacuation order finally came, it did so in the form of a short typed message delivered by an officer whose coat was as spattered with mud as anyone's. The hospital was to move to a new site farther back, closer to another road, under what was described as better cover. The window for movement was narrow. Artillery fire was expected to shift again. The work in the triage tent changed tempo. Stretcher cases already marked for rear evacuation now had to be slotted into specific trucks. Those who were fragile but not yet operated on had to be weighed against the risk of movement over broken ground. Some who, on paper, should have been left for later were moved up. And because the nurse judged that the resources available farther back might give them a chance they would not have if they remained. Others who looked better at a glance were held, their signs suggesting sudden collapse if jolted too soon. Ambulance spaces filled quickly. When no room remained, ordinary trucks were pressed into service, their beds lined as best as possible with straw and spare blankets. The nurse and her orderlies moved along the vehicles as they loaded, using the small reserve of morphine she had set aside. Doses were given to those whose injuries made every bump a threat of shock. She wrote as she could, leaning the ledger on tailgates, marking times as approximations when the sun and the sequence of movements were her only guides. In the midst of this, a staff officer tasked with overseeing the withdrawal noticed the discrepancy between the ampules in the main tray and the figures in the ledger. He asked, under shell-torn canvas and with engines idling outside, why the count did not match exactly. The nurse explained in clipped sentences how the reserve had been separated for the evacuation phase, how every dose was still captured in the book. He frowned, made a note on his own pad, and reminded her that controlled substances required strict accounting. He had no spare minutes for an inspection. The trucks had to move before the next salvo. His words were correct inside the framework of procedure. They slid awkwardly over the stretcher at their feet, where a man stared up at the sky through a gap in the canvas, waiting to be lifted. The nurse accepted the reminder, and knowing that any later auditor would see only his brief note and her ink lines, not the mud, the noise, or the way the torch had to be held between teeth at times to free both hands. When the convoy finally pulled away, the triage tent was one of the last to be struck. Some torn sections of canvas were left behind, not worth the effort of salvage. The hill, the punctured roof, the scattered medical supplies that could not be recovered in time remained. In any later summary, they would be described as moderate damage to temporary structures. The nurse sat on the rear step of a truck already crowded with patients. There was no proper seat. She held onto the frame with one hand, the ledger clamped under the other arm, the small reserve box now nearly empty wedged between her boots. Had each jolt sent pain through the men on stretchers and blurred the ink still drying on the last page. The guns continued to sound, now behind them rather than ahead. At the new site, farther from the immediate arc of the offensive, the hospital was re-established in fresh mud under different trees. The tents were raised again, some patched, some replaced. The triage table stood once more beneath canvas that still smelled of factory and storage, not yet seasoned by smoke. The ledger was laid open for inspection against the remaining stock of morphine. Totals were compared, minor discrepancies questioned, explanations given. In a unit diary somewhere, the hospital's experience of that night and move might have been summarized in a few lines. It would mention shelling, casualties received, damage sustained, relocation completed. And it would note that the staff performed their duties under difficult conditions. Names might not appear, roles would. Nurse, orderly, driver, clerk, surgeon. In archives that preserved such things, ledgers like hers remained among the stored papers. Decades later, a researcher leafing through them would see columns of times and doses, initials and categories, signatures repeated at the bottom of each page. The pages would feel slightly brittle, perhaps still faintly smelling of smoke and damp paper. To most eyes, they would look like routine administration. Behind those lines stood the reality of a winter night in a shelled field hospital, where triage had been done by torchlight and morphine logs kept under shaking canvas. The nurse's unofficial adjustments, moving the triage point, grouping entries, dividing stocks for evacuation, would not be visible as such. They survived only as small irregularities in column spacing and as decisions remembered, for a time, by those who had watched her work. In broader accounts of that offensive, maps would show arrows advancing and retreating across the front. Headquarters reports would measure progress in kilometres gained or held. The hospital would appear, if at all, as a symbol marking medical support. The night when shells fell short and caught its tents would be absorbed into larger narratives. Yet the quiet discipline inside those canvas walls, maintained under strain and bent only where necessary, shaped outcomes for many whose names never reached any history. The nurse's role, guarding triage discipline, protecting the morphine ledger, and pushing evacuation forward even as roads came under fire, was one among thousands of similar efforts spread along different fronts. They shared common tools, tags, ledgers, torches, and a stubborn insistence on order inside disorder. Remembering such work means looking closely at the small, persistent details. The scratch of a pencil on damp paper, the weight of a glass ampule in cold fingers, the movement of a stretcher away from a dangerous flap of canvas to a safer corner by a crate. It is in those actions that the story of frontline medical staff can still be traced, long after the guns have fallen silent and the ledgers have been boxed and numbered. For viewers who wish to hear more about these quieter corners and overlooked roles, they may choose to return here for future accounts.